You're all very welcome to our first InTwenty session. We've created the InTwenty series to bring together the postural care community and in just 20 minutes cover topics that really interest us, and we hope you too. We're kicking off with OT InTwenty, and we're delighted to be joined by Clare Canale of Red Robin Therapy. Clare has almost 30 years of experience as a paediatric occupational therapist and brings a wealth of experience working with children and young people in a variety of settings.
For those of you who don't know me, I am an occupational therapist and have been, as Sheena said, for a very long time. I worked for a long time for the health service, then followed by Lecky. And for the last 5 years, I've been working independently. Part of my work now is for Aergo Health and on a consultancy basis. So that's why I'm here today. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover today very quickly. That's just the brief topics. Obviously in 20 minutes, we're not going to have a huge amount of time to go into them in much depth, but I'll let you read those. So first of all, let's really think about dynamics. When we use the term dynamics in relation to wheelchairs and seating systems, we generally think, and correctly so, of the moving parts on the wheelchair or the seating system, but that's only one part of the equation. So the physics really reminds us that we need to think about how these parts are moved in the first place. So how the force to move them is generated. Thankfully, we don't have to understand the physics, but it is useful to be reminded that it is the wheelchair or seating occupant who creates the forces, because that helps us remember that even people with profound disabilities, they're not inanimate. It helps us feel more comfortable with the idea of dynamic components, because it's just another way of managing the person's needs. And it gives us more confidence when matching the user to the dynamics during setup, because that can be something that's quite frightening for people. So RESNA, the Rehabilitation Engineering and Assistive Technology Society of North America, they define dynamic seating as what you see in front of you there. The key parts being in response to intentional or unintentional forces generated by the client, and that these forces assist the client back to a starting position. So that helps us keep that information in focus. So dynamic seating can be a whole seating system. It can be within the wheelchair frame itself, or it can be a combination of those with components. Dynamic seating can be mechanical or non-mechanical. And there was some work done by Peterson and Lang in 2018, which really surveyed people who used dynamic seating and discovered that the trunk, lower limbs, pelvis and head in descending order were the areas that were most used with dynamic components. Just to give you some examples there, we have the air cell technology, which is a non-mechanical type of dynamic seating, and that's the Aergo PS there, which is part of Aergo Health. Then another type of, I suppose, elastomer, non-mechanical dynamics that we would use frequently and not consider it really to be a dynamic component would be like a harness with elasticity built in. Then we've got the hydropneumatic gas struts, which is the mechanical type. And really it could be at the knees, at the feet, at the hips or pelvis and the head. So lots of different ways of categorizing dynamic seating. What it isn't, it's not tilt in space, and it's not suspension components. So either caster suspension or railway suspension for self-propellers. If you remember that the definition of dynamic seating, it doesn't include manual adjustments, because the force has to be generated intentionally or unintentionally by the person, and the dynamic components return the person back to their original position. So probably onto some meatier sections now. Why is the clinical considerations and why dynamic seating is used? Three key clinical considerations really. exists firstly to absorb and dissipate client force. And that's probably what people most commonly associate with dynamic seating. So you would see it, you would be thinking about it in terms of extensor patterns and dystonic patterns of movement. The second area would be to allow movement, which provides sensory input. And this is something that's quite overlooked in special seating, I think. So if we think about it in terms of vestibular sensation, proprioceptive and tactile, and that can be provided in dynamic seating by mechanical means or non-mechanical means. And finally, our third clinical consideration would be about improving postural control. And that's really at either ends of the spectrum, where we're trying to help children, young people with hypertonia or with hypotonia, and again can be achieved by mechanical or non-mechanical means. So if we think about those areas in more detail, in terms of absorbing and dissipating force, the reasons behind that are really about reducing pain, preventing injury, and decreasing pressure and shear as probably the main ones. You could also expect that it might reduce agitation in some folks. It might reduce breakages on the wheelchair. It's another wheelchair seating system. Some of the forces are huge when a person goes into a spasm. And it's actually been shown that when spasticity is not met with resistance, that actually strength can increase. So, you know, that could be a reason then that feeds into and provide improved postural control. And I should have really said at the start of this slide that the arrows there are due really to indicate that none of these areas are standalone. They're not discrete areas. They all link in to each other and with it to varying degrees, just depending on the client's needs. In terms of sensory input then, we mentioned vestibular, proprioceptive and tactile. And really that can have an impact on energy levels. So if someone's overactive or under responsive, then providing movement at the right level can help to regulate that, can improve alertness. And in turn, then those feed into cognitive, psychological and social functions and additional body functions like respiration and digestion. In terms of improving postural control, we want to be able to allow range of movement through an available range, to regulate spasticity, reduce reflex activity and allow active extension where possible. In turn, then that should increase our seating tolerance and decrease fatigue. This is Daniel. Some of you may be familiar with Daniel. You may have met him before, but I just wanted to share this picture with you because Daniel is a really good example of how the seating system provides sensory input. Daniel loves to move. He's always on the go, and this in his prescribed seating is how he would sit cross-legged. It shunts all the pressure back onto his sacrum and his ischial tuberosities. When he's in the Aergo PS, the air sacs are filled up and they really compress him. So he gets a lovely hug from the seating system and he's sits for much longer in really what is a more functional position. But of course, there's things that we have to be careful with dynamic seating, and really for the user, you want to consider the person's orthopedic situation, particularly if there's any hip dislocation or subluxation. And that's a bit of a balancing act, really, because for a person with hip pain, allowing movement can increase that, but similarly, not allowing movement can also shunt the forces to where you don't want them to go. So again, it really comes down to your assessment. You would like to be careful if a person has very significant asymmetry, because many of the components are designed to move symmetrically, and therefore you don't want the forces acting on the chair asymmetrically and then perhaps the person not being able to come back to their original position. Their head alignment is important, and many of you will have heard me speak about this before. So if the head goes past the midline in the sagittal plane, it may trigger an extension movement or a starter reflex, and we obviously don't want to trigger anything. We're trying to prevent this stuff happening when using dynamic seating. And for someone who is sensory seeking, the movement might actually increase their sensory seeking behavior. So again, it's just about trying to get that balance right. You might also want to consider if movement interferes with function. So for example, and this is the OT in me speaking, if we're trying to do something, fine motor skills or feeding or something that requires perhaps eye gaze, movement of the head is obviously going to get in the way there. And for the wheelchair seating system, the setup is important because you can't have too much resistance. Otherwise, you might as well not have the dynamics. Sorry, that would be too much resistance. If there's not enough resistance, the person will very easily move the seating system or the components, but not be able to come back to the original place. Adding components or the dynamic parts may add weight to the chair. It may impact on how it folds, and you want to think about transport. So in setting up dynamic seating, just like any type of seating or wheelchair use, there is no magic wand available. Really, you are the magic wand. So it comes down to your assessment, really providing a comprehensive assessment, understanding what is causing the movement. So is it that a person is it extension? Is it dystonia? Is it low tone that's making them fall out of place? And what is the impact of that movement on their seated posture? Lots of observation while you go through this process. And then trying different products or components. I know it's not always easy, but it is going to be essential for this particular process. And really what you're trying to assess, does the product or the component provide that just enough dynamic, excuse me, that dynamic capability to allow the person to move, but also to bring them back to their original position. And having gone through this process, you should end up with a clinically reasoned excuse me, product or component selection. And then really people ask a lot of questions about transport. It really is a big worry for folk. So my research has told me that dynamic components are locked off for crash testing where it's possible to lock them off. There is actually not a requirement to lock them off for transport in either of the wheelchair standards that are relevant to wheelchairs and special seating. However, manufacturers usually recommend locking off where it's possible, and that's probably because that's been a requirement for them during crash testing. But some of you will know Bob Appleyard. He's worked with Unwins and has been, a guru of wheelchair accessible transport for many years, and that was his recommendation. So if you're in doubt, I would check with the manufacturer. However, some parents have said to me in the past, but if my son or daughter, if the component needs to be locked off, how can I be sure that their carers will activate it again when the journey is complete? And if that's a real concern, then I think you need to really look at a risk assessment to see, well, what is going to happen if that is, if the components aren't locked off during transport. Okay, I think we're doing pretty good for time because that's us onto our questions. Sheena, was there anything coming through?
Just checking on the chat. Not so far. Anyone who wants to jump in and ask Claire any questions, please feel free. I think you've done a brilliant job busting the myth that no one has any questions so
No
far.
one has any questions. That's super.
But then,
well,
yeah.
there's a list of the references for anybody that's interested. I think, Sheena, you're going to send out or make copies available of the slides?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, huge thanks to Claire. It's a really great first session to start our InTwenty series, as dynamic seating is such an important clinical approach that Aergo Health really looks into and incorporate in our product. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We'll make the presentation available as well as the recording to you all. The next session of the InTwenty, we're going to make this a monthly gathering, 20-minute gathering. And the next one will be on the 5th of July at 1 p.m. So if you can keep an eye out on our socials for our next topic, that'll be great. And if you're interested to learn more about the Aergo PS, I'll be in the European Seating Symposium next week. And I'll also be at the PMG conference. So feel free to come and give Aergo a go and feel how we are providing dynamic supports with our AirCell solutions. And also, you can always book a demo with us, hello@aergohealth.com. That can be done online or in person. So feel free to reach out. And also, big thanks to Claire again. I'm going to end the recording now.
Thank you for joining us for this InTwenty webinar. Make sure to hit the subscribe button to keep up to date with any new content from Aergo Health.